Okay, so last week we got all of 2 slides along in this, so I hesitate to do this, but let me briefly review what we were talking about last week, just so we could kind of move into the next part of it. So the goal of what we're doing right now, this is an introduction to a study of the 10 Commandments, and really where we were looking, and where we've been looking for the last couple of weeks that I've been here, is at the basics of the law and its role in the bigger scheme of things, in the larger scheme of salvation. The revelation of the law to the Jews that gave them an understanding of the nature of God that was superior to what the people around them had. Now, it may not have been superior to some of their ancestors like Abraham and people like Noah, who had it seems like in some ways a very close relationship with God, but it included a level of detail that nobody had ever seen before in terms of the requirements and expectations that God had. So the law had a purpose in revealing God's nature, it had a purpose in revealing the problem of sin and just how serious a problem that was, and it also had a purpose, Paul tells us, in showing the inability of humans to comply with God's righteousness. That because of our sinful nature, we were simply unable to meet the demands of the law. So Paul, at no point is Paul saying that the law is flawed or is broken or is damaged in some way. What he's simply saying is that because the law requires perfection, no one is ever going to be saved by the law. All they're ever going to be able to be done is convicted of sin by the law. And so that's the problem that we see here in Romans chapter 3 that Paul is articulating, is that the law is just telling you this is what God expects, and then everybody blows it. So we went through, we took a look at this, and then of course we understand that then the fulfillment of the law, not the replacement for the law, but the fulfillment of the law comes through Christ, through whom a new system is revealed. So it isn't just that Jesus gives us an exemption from the law, or a free pass so we don't have to follow the law. It's that Jesus sets up a new system, a system of salvation through grace that doesn't depend on the law at all. Now that doesn't mean that some of the principles of the law don't continue to exist, because those are revelations of God's character. But what happens under the law is that Jesus fulfills its requirements through the cross, and then it is set aside, and now this righteousness by faith is what takes its place.
And it's all legal. I mean, the law ultimately was a contract between God and man. And ultimately, Christ fulfilled all the requirements of that contract, thus eliminating the need for it to continue and paving the way for this new system we're talking about.
Yeah, the terms of the contract.
Right.
To use the legal term for that concept. And so, yeah, so the law has been fulfilled, the law has been completed, and now there is this new system of salvation by grace. And that's why when you look at the writings of Paul, you see he's very adamant that you can't go back to the law as a way to solve the problem of sin. And he talks about that in terms of, especially to the Gentiles, telling them, do not let yourselves be deceived by these Judaizers who are trying to come in and tell you have to act like Jews. But even among Jews, his position was that the old law has passed away. The old law is no longer the system. And so even though he continued in some cases to practice some of the tenets of the old law, in terms of taking what we believe was most likely a Nazirite vow, in terms of attending the temple, doing things that were tied to Jewish worship and those kinds of things, that he didn't do those things because he felt like they were in some way saving him. He did those things partly because of his Jewish heritage, and partly, particularly at the end of his ministry, in the book of Acts anyway, to help to try to mollify some of the critics of his ministry who were trying to say that he was going too far away from the Jewish background and
It's dishonoring.
It was dishonoring the most. Thank you. That's a good way to put it. And so that's the transition that we see happening here. But the reason that we're going through and taking a look at this is because one of the key points in all of this is that just because the details of the law have passed away and have been fulfilled doesn't mean that the principles, like I said, of the law have gone away. And so when we talk about the 10 Commandments, we're talking about very core principles of the law that existed, and in many ways, many of them we see existing without necessarily having been written down in a formal way, long before Moses ever gave them, and existing and being mentioned by Jesus, and in fact extended by Jesus to a higher level of obedience and behavior as well. So all the way back at Cain, we see, there's people understood it's wrong to kill someone, to murder someone. Cain knew what he did was wrong, and God says to him, sin is crouching at your door. So it's not like he was confused about there being something wrong with that. So even though there hadn't been a formal law-giving ceremony like there was at Mount Sinai, there was an awareness of that. And by and large, the majority of the laws that we see, they have their roots in ideas that are much older than the law of Moses, and they are ideas that continue today, at least in some form or another. So as we go through and look at the Ten Commandments, we're going to be able to see, and we're going to look at them in a historical context, but also in terms of how they carry forward to today as we look at them. So the last thing that we didn't get to this last bit of Romans is this understanding of the propitiation of Christ. So when we finished off here, we were talking about that that all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's in verse 23 up there. Being justified as a gift by his grace through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, whom God could display publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. So he was crucified. It was a public spectacle. It was, and of course then it was the gospel message was to make it known to all the world. So it's displayed in that sense as well as a propitiation. What does that word propitiation mean? It's not a word we use real often these days. Go for it, Ken.
Something that is given as a sacrifice to satisfy a requirement for someone else. Okay,
so a propitiation is a sacrifice or the paying of a debt for somebody else, basically. That's what we're talking about here. So then Paul continues and he says, this was to demonstrate his righteousness because in the forbearance of God he passed over the sins previously committed. And this, if you understand the context of Romans, he's not just talking about the sins that the Israelites or Jewish people committed. He's also talking about the sins that everybody committed. Because he talked previously in Romans about the fact that just because you're not under the law and you don't have a special revelation of God, doesn't mean you don't have an awareness of God's existence. Through nature, through the created order, that there's a general awareness. And here again, we know things like murder. There's really no significant society among humans that has ever existed where murder has been okay. And so there's a variety of other ones that are like that as well. Steve?
Well, and I've heard that referred to as the moral law.
Yeah.
So it was unwritten, it's written, but it still exists today. There's a moral law of God.
Yes. Yeah. And so that the way that I think of that, or the way that I suspect that sort of came into play, is that when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they became aware of both good and evil, of what it meant to do good and what it meant to do evil. They became aware of all the complexities and all of the, all of those, more than just the one thing that they knew, which is don't eat from this tree. That's the one thing you're not supposed to do. So now they have an awareness of that, and when they get that awareness, then that is an awareness that they pass on to their children to some extent through a moral conscience, but also that they presumably would pass on to their children, or at least would be expected to pass on through training, the same way all of you who had children trained your children in what was right and what was wrong. And so but as we know from history, we just have to look at our own country's history in the last, over the course of the 250 years we've been a nation. What tends to happen in succeeding generations is there tends to be a degeneration of that moral code. That for various reasons, whether it's because parents don't do a great job of passing it on, whether it's because of outside forces that lead people to different thinking and different ideas, whether it's, there's a whole lot of different ways and reasons it happens, but there tends to be a gradual falling away in terms of the behavior of people. Sometimes there's a restoration that brings people back or brings a nation back. Sometimes the nation kind of just collapses. But historically, that's what we see. And I think in the case of Noah, the ultimate version of that is what we see, where the whole world got worse and worse and worse, except the one thread Seth's lineage that led to Noah, the whole world just got worse and worse and worse until finally it was just wipe it all out and start over again, you know. So when we talk about this idea of the forbearance of God, it's not just for the Jews who were not complying with the law, it's also for the Gentiles who didn't have the law but had this moral code, this moral understanding, and they weren't following it. And so Paul talks about that for the Gentiles there was grace ultimately because of Jesus' sacrifice. For the Jews there was grace built into the law, but that grace ultimately depended on the sacrifice of Christ. And it was that sacrifice, that propitiation, that worked not only forward through time in order to help us today, but that also worked backward through time to cover over those sins that God had shown grace to, because it was enabled by the sacrifice that was made. Okay, so he says he does all this to the demonstration of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith. Sorry, there's a little footnote there. The one who has finaz, I don't know even how you would say that, who has faith in Jesus. So, yeah, it was so.
What is the FN for?
Normally it comes with brackets, but I think I was using a different version or something, and so it didn't put it in brackets, so I didn't notice it in there. But anyway, yeah. Anyway, so I just go nuts with my spelling sometimes. You just never know when it's going to happen. So, the thing that. The critical thing we need to understand here, and this is important, we'll see this in a minute when we start looking at the Ten Commandments as well, is that there are two core pillars of God's nature that are the most important for us when it comes to our interaction with Him. One of them is His justice, His righteousness, that He is absolutely righteous. There is no turning away from Him. There is no close enough. There's no, well, we can make an exception in this one case. His righteousness is absolute and it has to be satisfied. But He also has grace and love. And the love at least is an absolute thing in the sense that He loves completely, but it is bounded by His righteousness. And the problem for God, in the sense of that we create for Him, is that His righteousness and His love are at odds when it comes to us because we are sinful. He loves us and He doesn't want bad things to happen to us, but His righteousness demands that justice be done when sin is committed. And so ultimately what Paul is talking about here is, as the just and justifier, is that the cross, Jesus' sacrifice, makes it possible for God's righteousness and justice to intersect and function in a world and with a people who are not righteous and who do not meet the requirements of the law. And so Jesus creates that possibility, that way of solving that problem, so that we can exist in God's favor without necessarily actually personally meeting the requirements of His justice and righteousness. And so Paul finishes by saying, do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish or uphold the law. And what he means by that is not we follow every requirement of the law. What he means is what we've been talking about already, that we are saying the law was good, the law was from God, but the law has been fulfilled, and faith now gives us a new system, a new law, if you want to even call it that, that establishes our relationship with God. Okay? Jerry?
I think that's the primary point that he's making. I think, though, that we have to remember that throughout a lot of Paul's writings, he talks about the faith that they had under the old law. Habakkuk 2:4, that faith was important under the old law, but not at the level that it appears to be under the new law.
Yeah, well, you're right. He definitely references faith under the old law, and I would argue actually that it's just as important. The difference is simply how we carry out that faith.
Okay, yeah.
You know, under the old law, the problem that the average Jew had, that Jesus identifies. Now, the Pharisees' problem goes above and beyond that, because the Pharisees, it's not only that they don't have faith, it's that what they're practicing is actually a lie. They're doing things that are not what God wants, built into what they're doing that makes it look like they're doing what God wants. But the average Jew wasn't doing that kind of stuff. The problem the average Jew had that Jesus identifies is that they did lack faith. They were following the rules because that's what they'd been told they had to do, you know, and that's what they had come to, how they'd come to define themselves is by their rules and their regulations. But Jesus says, you don't have faith. You're not doing it because you have faith in God. You're doing it because that's just how you come to define yourself. And so I think that faith under the old law led you to carry out the requirements of the law, to be obedient and to do those things. Faith in the Christian system, or the system that Christ established, leads us to be obedient as well, but it leads us to an obedience that's based more in principle than it is in regulation.
If you look at Hebrews 11.
Hang on, she raised her hand before you started. Sorry.
Oh, this talks about when we have faith, we truly fulfill the law. And that, I mean, it just talks about it.
Yeah.
It doesn't say we establish the law. It just talks about us fulfilling the law. And that makes more sense to me.
Yeah.
We're fulfilling it, not establishing it.
Right. Well, the word established, like I said, I think not the best word there. But.
Yeah.
Jerry?
I was just going to refer to Hebrews 11 on the faith of those
Right.
patriarchs,
Yeah.
those that were under the old law that he's talking about. And that's the ones he's referring. He's incorporating their faith into the current
Yeah.
situation.
Well, and not only is he to talk about the people in the old law, he goes further back than that.
Further back than that.
To talk about people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob who weren't under the old law. They were under the even older law that was kind of the more generalized moral code that existed before the law of Moses was handed down. So the core, and I think, Jerry, I'm glad you bring this up, because the core of this across the board is faith. You see faith in God's people at every stage, whatever whatever the code or law or system that they're following, the covenant, if you want to use that term, that they're following, faith is what's driving them in that. And the Hebrew writer identifies that in the case of up until the Christian system, that faith had always been in something that was still over the horizon, you know, and that now, even though our faith is still in part is in something that is to come, that the fulfillment of all of those things that we experience gives us an advantage, a benefit that none of those predecessors had, because they had not seen the fulfillment that came through Christ. Tim, did I say
And
that?
that same chapter goes back as far as you want to go, almost all the way, because he brings in Abel.
Yeah.
From the group of faith.
Yeah.
So it's been there a long, long time.
Yeah. Adam doesn't get his name in there, but anyway, okay,
Right.
all right, yes ma'am. Oh, sorry, yes.
If you look at Moses' law, the cross, Moses' law fizzled out. Cross did take care of the sacrificial law, but not of the moral law.
True.
And I think that's what a lot did not understand. And today, they do things because that was in the law. It's only the moral law that goes further. Everything else stops with
Yes.
the cross.
I think that's true. The regulation-based aspects of it go away or are fulfilled, and what's left is the moral law, those principles that carry forward, that existed before the law of Moses was laid out in detail, and that will exist through the end of time. So, okay, so that is a foundation that we need to have to kind of get started with this. Now, hopefully we can get through the rest of this part, because the rest of this is actually, the introduction is relatively straightforward. Then again, I thought the first part of it was relatively okay, so what I want to talk about is what gets us to Sinai, okay? So we need to have a brief sort of basis in this, and I know you all know these stories, but I just want to go over them and kind of remind us of them as we establish ourselves at the foot of Mount Sinai. So we have, the situation has developed that what was a great blessing to the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that brought them to the land of Egypt to avoid a famine, to sustain that family, and that enabled them to grow from a population in the low 70s to a population in the couple of millions over the course of 400 plus years, that has turned into an affliction. So it was a good thing when it started, but it's a bad thing because the Egyptians have become understandably, to a certain extent, increasingly nervous about this massive population of non-Egyptians who live in their land and who keep getting more and more and more in a way that the Egyptians clearly were not. And this is not just, that they're just healthier or something. This is God's intervention. He is growing a nation, and he's making it happen in what we would probably call a miraculous way without it being necessarily obviously miraculous. And just for reference, the difference between those two things is, in my mind at least, is, parting the Red Sea is an obvious miracle. That doesn't happen anyway except through supernatural means. Having somebody get healed that's sick can be a miracle even if there's nobody who laid their hands on them or something like that. So he's involved in making that happen. But the Egyptians are understandably deeply concerned about this, and Exodus chapter 1 says that a new Pharaoh comes in who doesn't remember Joseph. And we don't know for sure whether that means it's a new Pharaohic dynasty, which is entirely possible, given the fact that there were a series of Pharaoh dynasties in Egypt, or whether it's simply that we've moved far enough away in time that the Pharaoh, perhaps not so much that he's forgotten Joseph, but it's kind of one of those things of, what have you done for me lately? Great, yeah, you saved the nation 400 years ago, but now we've got other problems, we've got other issues, and we've got to deal with this. And so that Pharaoh enslaves the people of Israel, makes them suffer, and the idea he's hoping is that it will gradually at least reduce their numbers, but that doesn't work. And so eventually the Pharaoh issues the decree that orders the killing of all of the baby boys that are born, with the idea being that if you can wipe out all the males, at some point you will definitely stop the population growth of the people. And we have Moses, of course, and his mother puts him in a reed basket, puts him in the Nile. He is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. He is raised in the palace, although his mother is able to actually wean him and take care of him while he's still young. He's raised in the Pharaoh's palace. Ultimately, he comes to find out that he's a Hebrew, or he learns he's a Hebrew in some way. And when he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew, he kills the Egyptian taskmaster, realizes that he's been observed in doing that and that he's going to be in trouble, and so he flees the land of he flees the land of Egypt to go back closer to where his people come from. And it's when he's there that he encounters the Lord, and that's the conversation we walk into here in Exodus chapter 3, when God says to Moses, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Amorite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite." You could have just said Canaan, but whatever. So it's important to recognize a couple of things out of this. Number one is he says, "My people," okay? He's already adopted them. At what point did he adopt them as his people? What's that?
Abraham.
Abraham. Yes, Abraham is when he adopted them. He made a covenant with Abraham, and so from that point on, Abraham's descendants, as numbered ultimately through Isaac and then through Jacob, would be his people. So he says, these are already my people. It's not like I'm just now adopting them. He's saying just now is the point at which I'm going to intervene. And the second thing is that Moses' job is going to be to go and get them and to take them to their promised land, part of the covenant that he made with Abraham. So he is reiterating his covenant with Abraham to Moses, who may not really have much of any knowledge or understanding of that covenant, because remember, this would have only been an oral tradition that was passed down, and in Moses' case, his interaction with his own people was a lot more limited than almost anybody else who would have been a Hebrew at the time. So then he says, "Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you will bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." And we know that that Moses was not excited about this idea. That he argued with God on a number, over and over again, trying to get out of it. And finally, after giving him a number of different miraculous signs that he could do and different things like that, God finally just stopped arguing and did what every parent eventually does when their kids won't obey it. It was basically, look, you're going, and I don't care what you have to say about it, And so he says to him, though, "The king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all of my miracles, which I shall do in the midst of it, and after that he will let you go. I like, I forget which, there's several other translations that say that I will strike Egypt with all my wonders. And I like that term better because there's this idea of the scope of what he's going to do. Most of the miracles that we encounter in the Bible, with a few exceptions, are localized, personal kinds of things. What happens in Exodus is not. Particularly what happens with regard to Egypt. Egypt is a huge land. It is the most powerful empire in the world when Moses walks into there to ask for the release of the Israelites. And God humbles that land and brings it low because the Pharaoh will not let the people go. And because I think of what that Pharaoh and his father had done to the Israelites, to the killing of the babies, the enslavement of the people, there's a punishment and there's a consequence that's coming, not just because of what the Pharaoh won't do now, but because of what the Pharaohs have done already. So then God also explains who he is to Moses, and he explains it in a way that he's never explained it before. He says, I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty. That's the El Shaddai. But by my name, Lord, I did not make myself known to them. Now we say the name Lord, but that isn't a name, that's a title. But it is a name, it's just that the Israelites don't write the name. It's not like Tom or something like that. The word or the letters YHVH, Yahweh, or nobody knows exactly how it's pronounced. That means Lord because that's the word that they've associated with that. So he actually says to Moses, by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. In other words, I'm telling you and I'm telling my people now more about myself than I revealed even to Abraham, who was my friend, who was the guy that I was collaborating with for this great plan that I had. I still didn't tell him everything, and I'm telling you even more. And he says, I also established my covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. Furthermore, I have heard the groanings of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Now, don't let that make you think that God forgot his covenant for 430 years. What he's saying is, I am stepping in to honor the covenant at this point. I am now remembering it in the sense of I'm carrying out the promise that I've made. The simple fact is that it would not have worked to have taken those 72 people that went into Egypt and have had them go conquer the land of Canaan. That would have been ridiculous and completely unworkable. He needed to build a nation, and he needed those people to pay attention to him and to focus on him as their salvation. If you have 2 million people and you have built yourselves a militaristic society like the Spartans did, for example, you're not going to depend on a God to rescue you or save you or believe in that God particularly, because you can do it yourself. So he needs a bunch of people, but he needs them to be people who will be responsive to him and not simply think that they can go do it all on their own, which they still did, but at least not as much maybe. So he's creating and he's using the Egyptians to help create the environment in which his people will be different from most of the rest of the, well, not just most, all of the rest of the prominent or powerful nations in the world around them. So he says, say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from Egypt. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. So here he's talking about this idea. I'm going to rescue them. I'm going to do these great judgments, and I'm going to be your God. And this is an important thing because up to this point, for most people in the world, the notion of God up to this point was an idea of a God that was localized. So the Egyptians had their gods, and for the Egyptians, the reach of the Egyptian gods was pretty much the outer edge of Egyptian territory. That was what the Canaanites believed, that's what the Amorites believed, that's what the Babylonians would come to believe. If you go through and look historically at pagan peoples who believed in polytheistic gods, they believed that their god's power was limited to the region in which they controlled. And so somebody who believed in Baal also believed in Asherah, and also believed in a lesser extent in the gods of Egypt. And they didn't worship the gods of Egypt, but they recognized the gods of Egypt must be really powerful because Egypt is really powerful. And part of the reason, this gets into sort of a weird theological discussion, part of the reason that ancient cultures felt such a strong need to try to conquer other cultures was to expand the reach of their God for them. Because the territory that they controlled was also a place where their God was now. And so for the first time, a God is revealing himself and saying, I'm not like those gods. I'm the Lord your God, and I'm everywhere. And in fact, that's actually built into his name. And part of what he talks about to Moses that we're not covering here, that he's talking in terms of, I'm not a limited God. I'm not a God that's stuck in one location or another. I am the God of the world, of all of creation. And I'm going to be their God. So they're going to be unique in terms of the people that they are, because they're going to worship a God who is the actual God of everything. Hey, sorry, we're jumping ahead a little bit here. Let me just get back there for a second. So we know Moses goes into Canaan. He performs a series of miracles and ultimately calls down a series of plagues on Egypt. And he goes through it, and you could argue that they're progressively worse. I don't know that it's so much that as they are progressively destroying the culture and power of the Egyptians and their gods. We're not going to go through this in detail, but if you go through and look at each of the different plagues on Egypt, each one of them is not only an attack against something that's really important to the Egyptians, but it's also an attack against the power of specific gods. Whether it's the god of the river Nile when it's turned to blood, whether it's the god of the sun when it becomes night and there's no light. Each and every one of those is a demonstration of power that is a direct affront to one of the major deities of Egypt. And so God is demonstrating his power over the Egyptians. And here again, if you understand, if you don't have any context, it's still impressive. But if you understand it in the context that I've just explained it to you, that the Egyptians believed that within Egypt, their gods were absolute. No other god could come in and just kick them out or take over or show them up within their own land, because they were the gods of that land. And now this god, who they'd never even heard of before, comes in, and it's the god of these slaves, and he comes in and he just decimates their gods and the land and all of this different stuff and the power of the Pharaoh, and demonstrates over and over again that he is stronger than anything else in Egypt and any of the gods that the Egyptians believe in. And that is a very powerful statement that God is making that's bigger than just, hey, look at all the stuff I can do.
And it's a fascinating insight into the nature of God, to the level of detail that he is aware of what's going on in the world that he created. We forget that sometimes. God knew every one of those idols that the Egyptians worshipped, and knew exactly how to target them and hit them and destroy them and demolish the confidence that the Egyptians had in their gods.
And it's one of those things where actually the reason we don't realize that, I think, most of the time is because we don't know all the details. And it's only as you learn more of those details that you start to realize, man, there's like multiple levels that this is taking place on. And I think when we talk about the plagues on Egypt, I mentioned this a minute ago, this is not just about Pharaoh being forced to let them go. Part of the reason that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, he actually said, is I'm doing this, he says this to Moses, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart because I want to multiply my wonders. I want to have an extra opportunity to show everybody else what happens when you mess with me, what happens when you mess with my people, and what happens when you try to get in my way. And this is important because it isn't just important because it's what gets the Israelites out of captivity, but as they are traveling along, there are nations that they encounter who do not want to mess with them because they are hurting what happened to Egypt. And you can't blame them. I mean, why in the world would you want to get involved with people whose God destroyed the most powerful nation in the world? You know, so he's doing this in part, and he's using the hardness of Pharaoh's heart in part to make a statement, and to also impose consequences for what the previous Pharaoh and then this Pharaoh continued to carry it out for the killing of the boys and for the enslavement of his people.
The Pharaoh himself was considered deity.
Yes.
So for a deity of a land like the Nile River Basin, to submit to a foreign god or another god is to say, I am less than what I am. So the hardening of his heart came pretty natural.
Right.
And so God demonstrated he had power over the physical world, over animals, the Nile River itself, the firstborn. And that's a pretty specific
Yes.
plague right there, to say I'm going to kill the firstborn only. Well, that's really hard to say, well, everybody just got malaria.
Right.
It's, no,
Right.
very specific. And so, anyway, it really brought down the Pharaoh to a point where he's like, we just can't sustain this anymore. So it really proved who God was.
Yes. And that's what gets us to this last bit of this, the last of the plagues. And we see this in Exodus chapter 12, that God has told Moses to tell the Pharaoh that one last plague is coming. And then in Exodus chapter 12, there's the whole Passover thing, but we've talked about that on a number of occasions before, so I'm not going to go into it again. But it says that it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. This is the ultimate assault on the levels that we've been talking about, because the most powerful and most revered of all of the gods of Egypt were the gods of life and death, particularly the god of death. This is an assault and a demonstration of power over death and life as well. And so the most powerful of all the Egyptian deities are being brought low by God in this. And of course, also there is this tremendous loss that's taking place. As Steve says, there is the obvious power of differentiation. So, and both in terms of the firstborn dying, and then of course among the Israelites, no firstborn dying because of the Passover taking place. And so this happens, and again, yeah, as Steve says, this is the point at which the Pharaoh says, okay, we cannot sustain this. We can't keep doing this. You look throughout history at some of the worst empires, some of the ones that have done the worst kinds of things, and most of them at some point have had to say, we can't keep doing this because there's something standing in our way, whether it's the Soviet Union running up against America and ultimately saying economically we can't do it, whether it's Yamamoto, the emperor of the emperor of Japan, whose name suddenly escapes me, finally recognizing that his war council was never going to end the Second World War, despite the use of the nuclear bomb, and ordering them to surrender because his people had to survive. Whatever it is, you see this happening, and this is what Pharaoh is doing, is that number one, he has been humbled to the point where he has to recognize on some level that even if he still thinks he's a god, that the god he's dealing with is so far beyond him that there's no way he can compete. And second, that if this continues, eventually his nation is going to be wiped out. And so he finally recognizes that he has to let them go. So it says that he called for Moses and Aaron at night, and he said, rise up, get out from among my people, you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go and bless me also. Now that's kind of interesting, because we didn't talk about this in detail, but the conversation that Moses had, the original request had been, let me take the people and all of our stuff, and we're going to go worship, and then we'll come back again. And so this had gotten progressively, the negotiations over this had gotten progressively more complicated. But what's interesting here is that Pharaoh is still trying to save face, because he's still trying to make it sound like you're just going for a 3-day journey out in the wilderness, so go ahead and do that now. You know, now everybody knows that's not really what's going to happen, but it allows him to basically sort of save face and not have to acknowledge that, yeah, I've lost and I'm giving up and you guys can go. And so he finally gives them permission to go, and he asks for the blessing of of Moses and Aaron as well, because of the loss and the damage that's been incurred. So at this point he is actually submitting himself to the authority of Yahweh, because he's asking for the blessing of Yahweh after all the things that have happened. And so then let me finish with here, because we're running it over time a little bit. It says, the Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we will all be dead if you don't leave. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls bound up on their clothes on their shoulders. The people of Egypt, it says, gave them gifts to get them to leave faster, and also to try, it doesn't say it in the scriptures, but it is almost certainly true that they did that in part to try to pacify the God who had just decimated their population and all the different things. They want them gone, and they want that God satisfied. They just have to come back and do any more bad things to them. But then I love this passage. It says, the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So the people of Israel have been in Egypt for 430 years. Now, they've been slaves for that whole time. That's probably been the last 100 years or so. But they have not had a home of their own. They have not been a people of their own. In a very real way, they haven't had a relationship with a God of their own for all of that time. And now, 430 years after Jacob and his family went down there, Israel comes out, and they are a free people. And they are God's people, and he is going to take them into the wilderness, and he is going to form a covenant with them, and he is going to establish his relationship with them in a way that he's never done with any people in the history of the world before that. And that is the journey that begins us to Sinai. Now, next week we're going to take a brief look at what happens when they get to Sinai, and then we will start looking at the Ten Commandments specifically. So, thank you guys for your participation and for your comments and everything.